right. Well, I think we've got a lot of information to cover, so we can go ahead and get started. And I think a few more people will probably be joining us. So just again, this is a Zoom webinar, so we'll only have video and audio for the panelists, so you don't have to worry about whether we can see your video or if you're muted. It's all taken care of for you. My name is Helen Meyer, and I'm the Development Director at Pine Tree Legal Assistance, and I have the pleasure of moderating our discussion this morning. And I'm joined by a great panel of experts at Pine Tree and Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, who are here to talk about domestic violence. Domestic violence was already an epidemic before COVID-19, but the health crisis has caused a tremendous spike in instances of abuse. Even as lockdown restrictions are lifted, the abuse will not simply end. It remains a critical time for survivors, and greater awareness and education are desperately needed. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so we are pleased to be able to provide some education and awareness around domestic violence in Maine and what civil legal aid programs in Maine are doing to support victims and survivors of domestic violence. We have 3 panelists with us here today. Lucia Hunt, who's the directing attorney of the Family Law and Victim Rights Unit at Pine Tree Legal Assistance. Megan Ginsner, who's the attorney with our Family Law and Victim Rights Unit. And Andrea Mancuso, who is at the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. And I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce each other. Lucia, why don't we start with you?
Hi, good morning. As I was saying, it's nice to see some friends introducing themselves in the chat. Since we have this webinar format, we don't have the opportunity to interact quite in the same way with the audience, but it's nice to know we've got some friends out there. And please do feel free to use the Q&A. We'd be happy to talk as we're having this conversation. So I'm Lucia Hunt from Pine Tree Legal. I've been the directing attorney there of our Family Law and Victim Rights Unit for a couple of years now, starting out my career at Pine Tree 14 years ago now. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lucia. Megan, why don't we turn it over to you to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Megan Ginzer. Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to participate here today. I have been at Pine Tree now for almost 2 years, and I currently am also in the Family Law and Victim Rights Unit, and I handle primarily protection from abuse and some protection from harassment cases in Portland District Courts and in Bridgeton as well.
Great, thank you, Megan. And Andrea.
Good morning, I'm Andrea Mancuso. I'm the Public Policy Director for the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. For those who don't know, MCDV is the statewide agency that serves and advocates on behalf of the 8 domestic violence resource centers across Maine. The Immigrant Resource Center of Maine is also a member program, which provides culturally specific services. We're often called on to lift up the lived experiences of survivors around statewide tables, including development and implementation around public policy, which is where my focus is. I'm also historically an attorney and spent about 10 years litigating protection order and family court cases with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, including several years with Lucia at Pine Tree's Portland office, where I had cases mostly in Cumberland County and the Mid-Coast. So looking forward to this morning's conversation.
Great, and thank you. Thanks to the 3 of you for joining us today, and thank you for everyone who's able to attend. We'll go ahead and jump in. If anyone has questions, please use the chat or the Q&A to ask them, and we'll monitor them and respond to them. But to get us started, Andrea, why don't you tell us a little bit about the prevalence of domestic violence in Maine, and also about the work the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence and the network of domestic violence resource centers in Maine are doing.
Great, thanks. Collectively, the 8 domestic violence resource centers serve approximately 14,000 survivors in Maine every year. On any given day, the DVRCs are working with over 500 Mainers with things like legal advocacy, safety planning, support, shelter. I think the community generally has pretty good awareness that the domestic violence resource centers shelter survivors. When we look at the data, that represents only about 5% of the total people who seek help from the resource centers. By contrast, the legal programs assist about 36% of all survivors needed. So the goal really is to provide holistic services in a variety of ways that survivors might need to help ensure safety. And we know that really this only scratches the surface, the folks that get to us. Statistically, 1 in 4 women in Maine will experience physical violence by a partner in their lifetime, and more than 10% will be stalked by an intimate partner. We know that a domestic violence assault is reported to law enforcement in Maine roughly every 2 hours and 22 minutes. And to put that into perspective, only about half of survivors statistically will ever engage with the criminal justice system. Just sort of what it looks like. We know that men are victims of domestic abuse and violence too, and last year we provided services to roughly 1,100 men. 82% of domestic violence, though, is perpetrated against women. So as we continue our conversation today, I will inevitably frame it in the context of a male perpetrator and female survivors, but want to acknowledge the cross-gender prevalence.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Megan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what laws are available to protect survivors and victims of domestic violence? And maybe tell us a little bit about the criminal versus civil system.
Yeah, sure. So in my position at Pine Tree, I am really operating within the civil system. However, oftentimes that intersects with things going on in the criminal sector. When our clients are seeking protection, there often is also a pending criminal case that's related. So in Maine, the Maine Criminal Code is found in Title 17A of the Maine Revised Statutes, and there are specific crimes that address domestic violence. And so Chapter 9 specifically is where you find a lot of those offenses against the person. So we have domestic violence assault, domestic violence aggravated assault, domestic violence criminal threatening, domestic violence stalking, and domestic violence reckless conduct. So those crimes all specifically have to do with crimes perpetrated in the domestic violence setting. Also, chapters 11 and 12 address sexual assaults. And so what happens when there is a criminal case that begins is usually there's law enforcement involvement, somebody calls police, the perpetrator, the person that's being accused of committing the crime will either be potentially arrested right then and there, or a warrant might get issued, or they may have a summons to appear in court. And at that point, it's the state of Maine that prosecutes crimes. So that's different than in the civil context where an individual would commence the action. When it's a criminal case, it's the state, either the district attorney's office or the attorney general's office, depending on the type of crime, or the federal, as the federal government if it's a federal crime. So when somebody has a pending criminal case, there are oftentimes going to be bail conditions that are put in place to protect the victim of the crime. And so in cases where it's domestic violence, oftentimes those bail conditions will look like no contact with the victim and any minor children. It may include a no weapons prohibition. There may be exclusion zones for the perpetrator to not be able to go to certain locations, specifically to the home of the survivor. And it can even include electronic monitoring. So there are protections that get put into place while a case is pending. And then a survivor has certain rights as the victim of a crime, where the district attorney's office in particular has a victim witness advocate. That person helps to keep the survivor aware of what's going on with the case. the survivor is supposed to have a say, be made aware of any plea offers that are made to the defendant, and to have a chance to participate in that process at the sentencing phase as well, and to be able to give their input. When somebody is convicted of a crime, they may be placed on probation or serve jail time or have some type of split sentence. And oftentimes there are conditions imposed in that context of no contact, maybe counseling. The batterer's intervention program may be imposed as well. And when somebody is incarcerated, a victim of certain types of crimes has the right to be notified when the defendant is going to be released. So, and that's not certainly an all-inclusive view of the criminal justice system, but there are protections in place for survivors, both at during the pendency of the case, as well as once somebody is convicted. And then, do you want me to transition to sort of the civil context, Helen?
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So my focus in the work that I do at Pine Tree is primarily with assisting survivors in seeking protection orders, which in other jurisdictions might be called restraining orders. So there are other civil protections available to survivors, certainly, but my focus is going to be on the protection from abuse process. And there are a lot of reasons why somebody might want to pursue protections through the civil protection from abuse process, outside of just the fact that there might be a pending criminal case. And there are protections available there, but there are also different and perhaps more holistic protections available through what we call the PFA process. And so, like I said, sometimes both are going on at the same time, but somebody who is, sometimes it's not, so that the survivor may have no other protection. There might not be bail conditions. Frequently, I work with individuals where there isn't a pending criminal case, and so they're seeking court-ordered protection. And so what happens is we receive referrals from our partner agencies, and we start working with the survivor, helping them. They've often already filed their protection from abuse complaint, and so we're sort of helping them to prepare for the court process. But in terms of what somebody will do to initiate the case, they would go to the courthouse and file a protection from abuse complaint. That's what we call an ex parte process, meaning that the defendant, the perpetrator, does not have the opportunity to participate because the victim needs immediate safety and protection. So the judge can issue a temporary order that provides protection, and then a hearing is set within about 21 days. And then I will be going to court with the survivor frequently to help them try to obtain a final order. So some of the protections that a survivor can obtain through that process include the court can order that the perpetrator have no contact with the victim and potentially with any minor children that might be involved, or limited contact in a very secure, safe setting, such as if there are minor children involved, there may be supervised visits that are allowed. The defendant can be prohibited from going to the survivor's home, school, business, place of employment, and be prohibited from having any weapons or firearms, which can be a really serious threat if somebody has access to those things. And so the other piece that's not available through the criminal process that is through the protection order process is that a survivor can seek economic relief. They can seek temporary support, child support, which can be often a barrier to somebody leaving a situation if they don't have financial resources. And so the court can order that child support be paid. They can order temporary parental rights where the survivor can be allocated sole parental rights, and the defendant could have either no contact or limited contact with the minor children. And a protection from abuse order can be issued for up to a 2-year period. And then there's also an opportunity for a plaintiff to seek an extension of that order beyond the 2 years, which can be really important as well, because oftentimes that 2 years isn't going to be enough.
Great. Thank you, Megan. You did a great job of distilling what I'm sure are many complex books of laws into a really brief explanation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We do have a question from one of our attendees, so that's related to the laws. So I'll just switch over to that. The question is, as a state legislator, I would be interested to know if any of you, through your experience working to utilize Maine laws to help victims and survivors, have any ideas of refinements or new civil or criminal initiatives that would be helpful to those being victimized. And I think we'll ask Andrea to take this one. I think some folks will know Pine Tree receives federal funding, and there are some restrictions on our ability to comment on some things without a formal invitation. And so Andrea, as someone who's not a Pine Tree staff member, I'm going to ask you to answer this one.
Sure. So my wish list. I think that, I mentioned earlier that only about 50% of survivors access the criminal justice system, but where long-term safety is often negotiated for survivors and their children is in the family court. And I think, having practiced in the family court and now working with the coalition, there's some real training needs for family court professionals who are working with litigants around domestic violence and what it looks like and how it impacts children. One of the real gaps that we've observed is guardians ad litem have a 4-day roster training so that they can be sort of certified to do guardian work. And despite the fact that overwhelmingly their high conflict cases are going to be domestic violence, they get about an hour and 15 minutes specific on domestic violence in the 4-day roster training. And that's just not enough to really have a deep understanding of, what you're going to see in those cases. And, we'd love to see a little bit more training for judges who are, the ultimate decision makers, because it's really inconsistent, the response that survivors get across the state. Civil legal representation, the Pine Tree's unit is fantastic, but more attorneys to take more cases and have a level of expertise that the Pine Tree staff have would really move outcomes for survivors. From the criminal side of things, victim notification is a huge hole. There's the criminal justice system is directed to when I think it's like when practicable and as time allows, notify victims of the rights and the dispositions and their abilities to participate, and that's a hole big enough to drive a bus through. And we find that survivors are often, learning about, conversations that happened just before the plea is going to be taken or sentence is going to be imposed, and without a sufficient time to really decide how to have an informed involvement with that process. Data collection, it's really hard to evaluate what changes that we're making and whether or not they have the expected, the intended result, because there are huge data gaps to our civil and criminal justice systems. And the Homicide Review Panel is actually, for its upcoming report, doing a 20-year look back and pulling out some themes of the recommendations that the Homicide Review Panel has had over the last 20 years. And I think that's going to be a really interesting piece of work to review. And I think some focus from the legislature on some of the recommendations that have really been thematically coming up over the last 20 years consistently will really be a thing to look at.
Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. That was wonderful. So I think we'll just hop back over to Lucia. Lucia, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about how and when Pine Tree began working on domestic violence cases.
Sure. At Pine Tree Legal, historically, when the laws around domestic violence, specifically the protection from abuse laws, were being created, late 70s, early 80s was really that time. And I know there may be some people on this call who were involved in that process. There were staff at Pine Tree who were working on creating that legislation too. And since 1978, we've had an attorney dedicated to domestic violence work on staff through a grant that we've been fortunate to get in Cumberland County for a very long time. So that dedicated funding and the length of time that Pine Tree's been focusing on this issue, coupled with now a very much expanded project that also focuses on sexual assault across the state, has meant that we have the ability to really because of the volume and also the length of time we've been involved in this topic, have some expertise around domestic violence and around the laws and how they apply in cases. So just to sort of echo some of the things that both Megan and Andrea have said on that. At Pine Tree, we do a lot of individual cases. I think we did over 1,000 in 2019 across the state. And we focus on protection from abuse because it is a really powerful tool to have a quick impact on particularly victim safety. We also do some limited extended representation family law cases, but as you look at trying to balance those two things, we tend to focus on the immediate safety cases a little bit more than we're able to do a lot of extended representation, just because it takes a really long time to get through the court system. And so balancing those two sorts of cases is one of the big challenges in doing this work, especially now. We really modeled our statewide project on the way that we've done things since 1978 in Cumberland County, and that is being part of a coordinated community response in each of the communities where we have attorneys doing this civil legal work. Our projects are all based on the premise that we're going to be working in partnership with domestic violence resource centers and sexual assault centers as well. We get all of our referrals through a special process directly from the DVRCs or the sexual assault agencies with which we're working. And that model really provides the support and coordination that's needed to effectively assist survivors of domestic violence through what is often a very challenging court process, particularly if you think about someone perhaps having a criminal case going on at the same time as a protection order, at the same time as a family matter, and the different ways that each of those systems are going to address the issue of domestic violence. It's really helpful to have skilled professionals to help through that process, and that includes having a close relationship between an attorney and an advocate who are working with the survivor through that process. So that's the way we look at doing the cases. We also have the opportunities to participate in some systemic work across the state and in coordination with the coalition, Domestic Violence Coalition, Sexual Assault Coalition, Wabanaki Women's Coalition. We are able to, at times, participate in legislative initiatives, and we also sit on the Family Law Advisory Commission and on the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Abuse, and those are seats that someone at Pine Tree or Legal Services has held for many, many years. So we're able to participate in some of the initiatives that go on around the state where we're using our expertise because of the volume of cases we do and the amount of work we do in this area to sort of inform some of those policies.
Great, thank you. Lucia talked a little bit about our getting a grant in the early days, and in my role as the development director, I did just want to do a shout out to some of our funders, particularly the United Way of Greater Portland, who gave us that grant in 1978 and has continued to fund the work at Pine Tree Legal, supporting our work in Cumberland County with domestic violence. And I know United Ways are in the middle of their campaign right now, so I just want to let everyone know that's how we got started in this area. We're really dependent on our funders, and that really was the seed money that we used to create this model, that we were able to then go to other United Ways to ask for funding, to replicate it in their areas. We took the model to get some federal funding, and then of course we also received some state funding for this work, and we also got funding through individuals who make donations to Pine Tree, and also Maine attorneys who support the Campaign for Justice. And there's a lot that goes in behind the scenes to make this work possible. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those funders. And Lucia, I also wanted to ask, you mentioned about the partnerships and specifically with the DV agencies, but I know there are a lot of other legal aid programs that we work with on these issues. Could you talk a little bit about what other legal aid programs in Maine are doing and how we work with them?
Sure. Yeah. So across across the state, of course, there are 5 or 6 other legal aid providers. The Volunteer Lawyers Project, in particular, is one that Pine Tree has worked closely with for many years. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention their director, Juliet Holmes Smith, who recently passed away, was really a pillar in, I would say, the domestic violence community. She was my mentor and the person with whom I actually had an internship at Pine Tree when I first started while I was in law school. And her dedication to the issue of domestic violence, I think, continues today. I know we have Liz on the call too, who's the interim director now at VLP. The programs that VLP has across the state really fill gaps that are incredibly important for survivors, because at Pine Tree, although we do our best, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are certainly limitations on the work that we can do, and we know that the need is much greater. We're every day trying to make decisions, really hard decisions about which cases we'll prioritize for full representation, or how we will use our limited resources in the most effective ways. So we know that the need is much greater than what we're able to do. And the Volunteer Lawyer Project has had courthouse assistance projects over the years, and they have other programs that have worked with the coalition and the domestic violence resource centers to prioritize trying to those cases that involve survivors. So that work is incredibly important. We also know that sometimes some of the barriers to leaving include things like immigration status. And so we're in very close contact with ILAP when we have cases that impact our clients and those types of barriers. We develop relationships where we can just, have a quick consult about what's going on with the client's case. And I know Megan has done that sometimes really on the fly with a protection order case when one of those issues kind of just arises in what can be a very quick turnaround, or I think maybe even while being in court, if I'm remembering correctly, in one particular case. So we do try to coordinate a lot with the other legal aid providers, and also Legal Services for the Elderly does a lot of these cases. It's really interesting. They have similar sort of experiences in the clients that they work with who are older. There are particular protections within the Protection from Abuse statute, and we have very similar challenges sometimes in making sure that those folks who are eligible to get protection orders are able to get them in the ways that the law is intended. So we work with them and coordinate with them and try to sometimes address some of these issues on the systemic level as well. Is that what you were going for, Helen?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
that's good. I just, wanted to make sure everyone knew that there are lots of organizations out here working on these issues.
Definitely.
Great. Well, we have a question from a participant, and this is very timely. And Andrea, I think maybe we'll start with you, and then we can also let Pine Tree staff answer. But how has COVID-19 been impacting victims of domestic violence across the state?
COVID and the public health measures have really impacted survivors and the advocacy agencies quite acutely. For the folks that are reaching out for services, about 72% of them in April through June of this year reported that COVID had negatively impacted their safety and that they had heightened safety concerns due to the pandemic. For those folks that did access emergency shelter, their stay with us was approximately 17% longer than pre-pandemic, which really demonstrates the sort of restriction in the community and how hard safe and affordable permanent housing has really become. And in order to keep both survivors and staff safe, the DVRCs, instead of bringing folks into the existing shelter structures, began hoteling survivors, which is significantly more expensive than bringing folks into the existing structures. And I think we, when mapping it out, it costs about $250 a day to shelter a survivor in a hotel when you think about room, food, gas cards, staff time to coordinate in a really dispersed way. So it's exponentially more costly to provide the same services in the in sort of the world right now. And we've really seen no decrease in the need for shelter. In fact, New Hope for Women, the agency that covers the Mid-Coast counties, sheltered 9 survivors during this window in 2019, and that number is at 30 currently. So really the need is quite acute. So we're really striving, the advocates across the state, to keep survivors in their homes whenever that can be done safely, which is also a real challenge right now because the structures in our courts that have been historically supportive of survivors kind of fell apart in March. PFAs dropped in the state all over, anywhere from 30 to 50% for really a 6-month period of time. And they've rebounded slightly, but are not at their 2019 levels. So the sort of structures there to support survivors continue to be hard. And family court and criminal court all but shut down for 6 months and really continue to be hard for survivors to navigate. The criminal court structures, we saw domestic violence offenders being sort of bailed out in circumstances where they probably would have been held a little bit longer pre-pandemic. And access to the court has been really hard for survivors. So there was a solid 3-month period where usually our role is advocating for better outcomes for survivors, and advocates, and I think, Megan and Lucia can comment, but I think attorneys too really spent a solid 3 months trying to reinvent access and what that looks like, just to make sure some of the basic things could be supported. And, we've had, delightfully, there have been some private foundations and some individual donors who have really stepped up, including the Gorman Foundation. And I think there's someone here on the call from the Gorman Foundation to, fill some of these gaps. But it's going to be a long haul, and the domestic violence resource centers are concerned about their ability to continue to support survivors at the level that we were pre-pandemic.
Thank you, Andrea. Megan, I'm hoping you can also talk a little bit about how your work has shifted due to COVID-19 and how that's impacted your advocacy and how you do your job.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I definitely echo what Andrea has already highlighted as far as access being a real challenge for survivors. And for me, in the work that I do, just from the very start of representing somebody, it would normally be that I would try to meet with somebody in person it's really hard, I think, when somebody's already dealing with being in a very vulnerable situation to then have to talk to a stranger about that situation. And so having that in-person connection, I think, was a helpful way to gain some trust and to be able to make sure the person knew, okay, this is who you're looking for when you get to court. You're going to recognize me. We've already met. And so we don't have that same opportunity right now because of COVID. So we're really trying to make that connection over the phone, which can be a lot more challenging. And so I've had to try to develop some techniques to do that. And then in terms of just in general, the way that the court system is functioning right now, and it's sort of been a transition from when the pandemic first started until right now. But I can say that right now, especially in Portland, they are doing a really conscientious job of trying to minimize the number of people at the courthouse. But then what that looks like is that there are staggered, where there normally was one large docket on a Friday that would have, maybe 3 pages of cases to be handled. They're now dividing that up. So there's a docket Monday morning and Monday afternoon and Friday morning and Friday afternoon, which has been tremendously helpful for reducing the crowding at the courthouses. But it also means that I'm probably going to court more often, having less cases on any given day, but maybe going to court more often. There are safety protocols in place at the courthouse, so masks are required, there's physical distancing, but some of the challenges that presents are if you have somebody who's already feeling a heightened sense of anxiety coming into a courthouse, having to wear a mask, not, and you know, for me, having to practice that physical distancing can be challenging just on a human level, because you're representing people who are already very vulnerable, and you're wanting them to know that you're there to help them and for that to be a safe space. And so what I've tried to do in my work is to meet my clients well in advance of when court starts at the courthouse, try to get them into one of the conference rooms that's available, and to limit the amount of exposure, because our clients are not only worried about their physical safety, the abuse that they've fled, having to see the defendant in court, but then also worried about their own personal health. And I certainly have run into situations where even just getting to court is a challenge. They may not have friends who can transport them anymore, or childcare is an issue with school being largely remote, just having to navigate all of those challenges. So especially in the beginning, but even now, just trying to help develop some tools, there is some opportunity for litigants to appear remotely, which we've definitely utilized in our work, either by phone or video. I have had folks wait in their cars if we think it's a situation where it's the other party's not going to show up and we're going to be able to get a default order, or if we know the other party hasn't been served, you know, just trying to limit that every individual's sort of exposure because of COVID is something I try to make a conscientious effort to do. And then in terms of at the courthouse, I think I mentioned the physical distancing is hard, you know, trying to negotiate with opposing parties, opposing counsel, while also keeping that distance. And then just in the hearing process, you're sitting next to your client, but there's this distance you're still having to maintain. And so I think that can be trying to do that without it being alienating or having your client feel like you're trying to be separate from them it's a challenge. And so I've been trying to work through all of that. The other piece is, for very good reason, and you know, we all have to keep our safety at the forefront, but we have less advocate presence in the court right now. And so the challenges that poses include, you know, we often would get referrals in court the day of court for those folks that didn't get referred to us in advance for whatever reason. The advocates that were there through these doors and other agencies would connect us with somebody who might need help that day. And so that's not able to happen in the same way that it was happening. And so I think that's just been an added sort of challenge as a result of all of this.
If I could chime in just for a minute, I mean, big picture, when we look statewide, especially right as the pandemic hit, and as Andrea mentioned, really the numbers of people filing plummeted for a while. The cases we were seeing were anecdotally, there's not a way that we measure this exactly, but they were cases where people were in very desperate situations. So it was clear that it needed to be even more of a safety or dangerous situation for people to try to access this process, the protection order process. And I think there were a lot of factors that were at play. Of course, concerns about physical safety and health and childcare and other people in the home that were immunocompromised. And, we just really heard a lot of pretty desperate situations. And I appreciated so much the ability to work with Andrea and to work with folks at the court to come up with some sort of creative responses and in some ways to what was going on. But overall, I mean, what we've seen, because the systems that were in place just aren't functioning in the same ways, is that we're able to help fewer people. It takes longer for each individual case for us to do it. And the structure of the way that the courts have responded, which is different across the state, but a lot of times dockets are staggered. So you have fewer people in the courtroom, but that also means that if there is someone who needs help, we aren't seeing them and there's not an advocate there to connect us with that person. So unless the court kind of goes out of their way to say, can you work with this person? We just don't have the same impact as we historically have had by having cases in advance, preparing them, going to a docket that has 30 cases, working with the Volunteer Lawyers Project, who often had volunteer lawyers especially in Cumberland County, which is in Portland, one of the larger dockets, and working really closely with advocates to triage like the entire courtroom. It's just not possible now. And so we know and we've heard from a lot of different sectors that the civil legal system, particularly protection orders for plaintiffs, just isn't functioning in the way that it has historically, in the ways that, you know, we've developed systems over time together to coordinate support for survivors through that process. And, you know, around the state, there have been some creative solutions. We're working with Volunteer Lawyers Project and Through These Doors in Cumberland County now to try to revive a remote version of the Domestic Violence Pro Bono panel. And Liz is doing a ton of work on that. So I have to shout her out for her ability to pick this up and to respond and try to reimagine the ways that we're doing things. At Pine Tree, we're trying to reimagine the way we're doing things too, doing things like unbundled legal services, because all of the mediations, for example, family law mediations, are remote. So we can really do them from anywhere in the state. And so we can use some of our team, even if they're not physically able to be in Franklin County, they can do a mediation there and hopefully try to resolve some cases that way. But we've also seen a huge backlog in family law cases. Protection order cases, although the numbers were way down, continued to be litigated in the courts through the pandemic, but family matter stopped. And so what that looks like for Pine Tree staff is that you have a case where there was a problem, you know, that when you first got the case a year ago that hasn't been resolved yet because they haven't been able to get to court. And, you know, they're trying to get through cases, they're trying to move cases now, but that problem that existed a year ago and should have been resolved by a final hearing in April isn't yet resolved. And so families are in these kind of untenable situations where they do need the court's intervention and haven't been able to get it yet. So that's kind of my big picture, sort of what the COVID-19 pandemic has looked like, especially at Pine Tree.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thanks to all of you for sharing that. It's definitely, I know everybody's having a challenging time these days, but it's really helpful to hear about how the pandemic is impacting victims of domestic violence in particular. I do want to save some time to get to some of the questions that we have today, and also ones that people submitted in advance. And if folks on the call have questions, please go ahead, enter them in either the chat or the Q&A. Andrew, I think I'll give this one to you. This is a question someone submitted in advance. Have there been any recent studies on domestic violence in Maine with data we can access?
Yes. So there's actually a really interesting study that MCEDV did in 2019, which is assessed the impact of economic abuse on survivors in Maine, and that was survey-based. We had more than 130 survivors who participated. It's on our website, so anyone can access it. Essentially, the takeaways are perhaps what you would expect. About 81% of survivors indicated economic abuse by the perpetrator impacted their ability to successfully separate. It showed in overwhelming numbers the percentage of abusers who take out debt in survivors' names and whose economic abuse makes it hard to make ends meet and provide appropriate levels of financial support for children. And so that's available on our website, and that report actually served as the basis for some legislation in 2019, which Lucia and I worked on together with Frank D'Alessandro from Maine Equal Justice, which expanded the financial relief available for litigants in protection order court, and spoke to some debt-related issues when debts are a result of economic abuse. So that's something on our website. You can also find really several studies from the last 10 years that are Maine-based, including on the prevalence of strangulation and some good work on certified batterer intervention programs. all of the report outs from the homicide review panel, I believe over the last 10 to 15 years are there as well. So I can send you a link, Helen, if you want to send it out to participants after the call so that anybody can easily access that information.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. I will send out a link. I'll send out an email to participants after this, and I'll share some links to those studies for people who want to do a little bit more. We also had a question. This is a fantastic question. How can regular people at this point help survivors? What are some actions folks can take? This is a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. There are some things that regular people, as you say, can do to help survivors. First of all, please spread awareness of the issues. We're recording this conversation. We'll send a link out after the event, and it will include it in our newsletters. Please share that with your friends and colleagues. Share the studies that we send you. Please talk about this issue and share what you've learned today. Spreading awareness is huge. Also, Andrea mentioned that the domestic violence agencies around the state and shelters in particular are facing just an exponential rise in their expenses to meet the needs of victims right now. Please, if you have the ability, support your local domestic violence shelter. We've got a list. Andrea shared this slide from their website with the domestic violence agencies across Maine. Please, if you're able, make donations or contact your local agency, learn a little bit more about how you can support them. I was really struck, Andrea, when you shared how the costs for providing shelter have really increased. And of course, there's such a huge need now. So thank you. And also I'll share, as I said, I'll share links after this. So to the extent you can spread information, that's huge. I think the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence is on Facebook and social media. Go to that, go to their website, follow them, like them, spread the word. That's incredibly important. So great question. Thank you for
asking. All of the local agencies are also on social media, and several of them have community newsletters that lift up specific needs or needs that are specific to the individual communities. So I would put a plug in to follow and like and share their community specific material as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a comment. VLP would welcome volunteer attorneys and non-volunteers to help with their program. So that's another great opportunity. And Liz, I'll follow up with you afterwards and get a little blurb from you, and I'll include that in our follow-up email. So that is for attorneys and non-attorneys, which is great. So if you want to volunteer, that's another opportunity. All right, I have another question here. I am appreciating you all lifting up the need for more attorneys. It is a thing that we hear all the time in the best of times, that there simply isn't enough representation, and especially now during COVID, as Lucia points out. How do we get to a place where there is enough free or affordable legal representation for survivors? I'll open this up to anyone who wants to answer from our panel, and thank you for this great question.
I think it's more money for legal representation. There's actually some really good data out there that demonstrates the improved outcomes that survivors of domestic violence in particular experience when represented by an attorney. And yet the reality is the vast majority are going to court without an attorney standing beside them. And it's not specific. It's not specific to Maine. It's a problem that survivors face nationally. There needs to be more money. It needs to be non-competitive. There just needs to be designated money in every state for experienced legal representation for survivors to keep women and children safe, particularly in the family court. And I think to the extent that anyone's having a conversation with our federal delegation, making that point and asking them to commit to more financial assistance to provide legal representation for survivors, particularly as they navigate the family courts, is a very much needed thing.
And I would just chime in, Helen works really, really hard at Pine Tree to get us funding for this program and for all of the programs that Pine Tree has. But we know that unrestricted funding can be very helpful to supporting all of our programs. And of course, we apply and receive federal funding as well. But we have had outreach from domestic violence resource centers over the last several years, and we've worked with them to try to get some increased federal funding to put a few more attorneys, particularly in spots where we know we really need them. And I'm thinking of more rural areas, including Bangor, including the Augusta area. We just really know what the need is out there. And they're, the grant picture looks like a giant jigsaw puzzle for our family law victim rights unit at Pine Tree. And unfortunately, we're a little bit smaller than we were a few years ago. And so we're really looking to get that funding back and working with domestic violence resource centers in particular right now to see if we can take advantage of those federal opportunities. Unfortunately, we weren't successful for two that we would have put two new attorneys at Pine Tree working with domestic violence resource centers starting October 1st. So that's always disappointing when we don't get funded for me, because we have this structure and we have this ability to really make a difference. And it's palpable, what the difference is in an outcome when you have an attorney who's representing a survivor. And we know that, anecdotally, because we do get a different result than the same person got when they were not represented a few years ago, in a similar type of case, or even the same case if we're trying to litigate something again. And so it's something that we continue to work on at Pine Tree, and I just can't thank Helen and the development team enough for all of the efforts that they put into keeping our staff where it is and hopefully increasing it so that we can continue to do the work.
Thanks. And thank you to everybody on the call who is a supporter of Pine Tree or the Campaign for Justice, all of our funders. We can't thank you enough because those donations really are what makes this work possible. I want to just get back to a few questions that we have about the economic abuse study and statutes. So the first one, do they have any policies coming up that can help financial protections of those abused? How does credit ruining by an abusive spouse get addressed during the legal process? Do they need to improve things? Are they stuck with debt forever?
Well, that's a question. Yes and no. So the economic abuse legislation that passed in 2019 did address some credit issues. It created a provision where survivors who have incurred a debt as a result of economic abuse have a mechanism here in Maine to stop debt collection efforts around that debt. And in addition to the PFA financial relief. And the third piece of that was an attempt to try and remove negative references from a survivor's credit report, so it's not really burdening them in perpetuity, this economic abuse that a perpetrator engaged in. And the legislation that passed would have directed the credit reporting agencies to remove any negative reference on a survivor's credit report that the survivor could demonstrate was a result of economic abuse. The Consumer Data Industry Association, which represents the credit reporting agencies, filed in federal court to overturn that piece of the legislation, and the federal district court recently just sided with them. But we learned yesterday that the Maine's Attorney General's office is going to appeal that to the First Circuit. So there's still hope on that particular piece. And, we're not done yet exploring ways that we might be able to accomplish that goal in a different way in case the court case continues. not to be supportive of the attempt. The family court, I think, also has a role here for folks who are, and Lucia and Megan, I would welcome your thoughts as well. But I think, you know, there's an argument that economic abuse is economic misconduct in the course of the marriage, and that should be considered in a division of assets and debts at the time the marriage is dissolved.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think you answered the question that we had from another panelist about the courts overturning that. So thank you. And I just want to mention another project of Pine Trees that does do some work related to economic abuse, and that's our low-income taxpayer clinic. We receive funding from the IRS. We have one staff attorney, and we use a lot of volunteers, both attorneys, CPAs, and enrolled agents who help people out. And through the Innocent Spouse Protection, we've been able to help some victims of domestic violence with tax debt, federal tax debt that's related. And we actually had a great success from one of our volunteers several weeks ago, where we were able to get the IRS to limit the responsibility to the victim and assign it all to her ex-partner. So we have that component too. Great. Well, it's almost 10 o'clock, and I think we've answered most of the questions in the chat. And so I think at this point, we'll say thank you to everyone for attending. Please, as I said, share as much information as you can. We really do want to raise awareness. And there's still a few more days in October, which is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We also invite people to support the work of Pine Tree and the legal aid providers. As Lucia mentioned, we are not doing this work alone. All of the other legal aid providers in Maine are working on domestic violence issues. So Maine attorneys, please support the Campaign for Justice. For others, please go to our website and support Pine Tree Legal Assistance. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate you joining, taking the time to learn about this really important issue. And thank you to our panelists. We appreciate you taking time out to share with us this morning.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.